An entitled man vomited on a royal guard's uniform, thinking his wealth and status would shield him from the fallout. But one unexpected response left him on his knees, humiliated in front of everyone. Here's what happened next. But before we continue, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Subscribe to the channel because tomorrow, at the same time, we'll bring you another story of courage and discipline from the Royal Guards that you won't want to miss. The purring engine of a metallic black Bentley Continental GT cut through the usual tourist chatter outside Buckingham Palace, its tinted windows reflecting the afternoon sun like dark mirrors. Richard Blackwood emerged from the driver's seat, his movements sharp, with the practiced impatience of someone who viewed the world as personally inconvenient. "Move," he barked at a young family trying to take photos, his Savile Row suit worth more than their entire vacation budget. "Some of us have actual business to conduct." His voice carried the distinctive edge of old money mixed with new arrogance, the worst combination of wealth without wisdom. The palace grounds were busy with the usual afternoon crowd, tourists from around the world gathering to witness the changing of the guard. But Richard saw only obstacles, his steel-grey eyes scanning the scene with the same contempt he reserved for examining failing companies before hostile takeovers. "Pathetic," he muttered, loud enough for nearby visitors to hear. "Look at this place. Ancient stones and rusty gates. In Monaco, they at least keep their palaces looking presentable." He adjusted his Patek Philippe watch, letting the sunlight catch its diamond-studded face. "This whole setup reeks of desperation, holding on to past glory with both hands while the paint peels." A group of schoolchildren scurried out of his path as he strode toward the palace gates, their teacher shooting him a disapproving glance that he didn't bother to acknowledge. His Italian leather shoes clicked against the pavement with military precision, each step a statement of ownership over the ground he walked on. "You call this security?" he scoffed, eyeing the palace barriers. "My summer house in the Hamptons has better fencing than this medieval joke." His voice carried the casual cruelty of someone who had never faced real consequences for his words or actions. The afternoon sun caught his perfectly styled hair, not a strand out of place despite the light breeze. At 45, Richard Blackwood had spent decades cultivating an image of success, from his hand-tailored suits to his carefully maintained physique. But there was something hollow behind his eyes, a hunger that no amount of wealth seemed to satisfy. "Excuse me, sir." A middle-aged woman in a tour guide's uniform approached him politely. "Would you mind keeping your voice down? We have several tours in progress." Richard turned to her with the same look he gave waiters who brought him the wrong vintage of wine. "I'll speak as loudly as I want, sweetheart. When you make the kind of money I do, you buy the right to be heard." He gestured dismissively at the palace. "This whole place is a tourist trap anyway. Might as well get your money's worth of entertainment." His attention shifted suddenly, caught by something that made his perfectly maintained smile twist into something uglier. There, standing at attention in his ceremonial uniform, was a royal guard, ramrod straight, dignified, and commanding the quiet respect of dozens of tourists who photographed him with obvious admiration. Richard's jaw clenched, an almost imperceptible tic developing in his left cheek. Something about the guard's stoic presence, the natural authority he commanded without speaking a word, seemed to scrape against something raw in Richard's carefully constructed world. His eyes narrowed as he watched a young child wave at the guard with unrestrained joy, the kind of genuine admiration money could never buy. "Well," he murmured, straightening his tie with manicured fingers, "let's see how long that dignity lasts, shall we?" Richard stalked closer to the guard's position, his expensive cologne creating an intrusive cloud around him. The tourists, who had been happily taking photos, began to shift uncomfortably, sensing the brewing confrontation like animals before a storm. "Look at this spectacle," he announced to no one in particular, his voice carrying the practiced projection of someone used to commanding boardrooms. "Standing there like some museum piece. Tell me, do they wind you up every morning, or do you run on batteries?" A few nervous laughs rippled through the crowd, more from discomfort than genuine amusement. The guard remained motionless, his eyes fixed forward with the discipline of years of service. His ceremonial rifle gleamed in the afternoon light, each brass button on his scarlet tunic reflecting decades of tradition. But Richard saw only another challenge to his self-proclaimed authority. "You know what's truly pathetic?" He circled the guard like a shark testing its prey. "It's not just the standing still part, it's this whole charade, the fancy hat, the shiny buttons, the toy gun." He gestured expansively at the palace grounds. "All of it screaming, 'Look at me, I'm important,' when we all know it's just cheap theatre for the tourists." A pair of elderly men wearing regimental ties had stopped nearby, their weathered faces darkening at Richard's display. One touched the service pin on his lapel unconsciously, years of military bearing evident in his posture, despite his age. But Richard was too absorbed in his performance to notice the growing tension in his audience. "I mean, seriously," he continued, pulling at his custom-made shirt cuffs. "I've got security at my London penthouse who could do this job better. At least they're trained for the modern world, not playing dress-up in costumes from the last century." The afternoon had grown warmer, but several tourists had begun to move away, creating a widening circle around Richard and the guard. A mother hurried her children past, whispering something that made them look back with wide eyes. But Richard seemed to feed off the discomfort he was creating, his voice growing louder with each taunt. "You want to know what really gets me?" He stepped closer, deliberately invading the space that protocol and basic decency should have protected. "It's how everyone acts impressed by this, like standing still is some kind of skill." His voice dripped with contempt. "I've got art in my collection worth more than you'll see in a lifetime, and it does the same thing. Stands still and looks pretty." The guard's composure remained unbroken, but there was a subtle shift in the air around him. A tension that veterans in the crowd would recognize, the kind of stillness that precedes decisive action. Richard, however, mistook this disciplined restraint for weakness. "Oh, look, everyone!" He raised his voice further, playing to his unwilling audience. "He's doing his best statue impression. Should we throw coins? Is that how this works?" He reached into his pocket, pulling out a handful of change with exaggerated flourish. "Though, I suppose that's a bit beneath you, isn't it? Standing here day after day, pretending to guard something that's already dead." One of the elderly men stepped forward, his bearing suggesting military service. "Young man," he began, his voice carrying quiet authority, "you might want to reconsider." "Reconsider what?" Richard cut him off with a dismissive wave. "Pointing out the obvious. This whole setup is a joke, a tourist attraction trying to pretend it's still relevant." He turned back to the guard, his voice taking on a nastier edge. "But that's what really bothers you, isn't it? All this attention, all these photos, and you're still just furniture, a prop in someone else's show." The sun caught his diamond cufflinks as he gestured mockingly at the guard's immaculate uniform. "I mean, look at this get-up. In the real world, in my world, we measure success by what you achieve, not how long you can play mannequin." His voice carried the bitterness of someone who had everything money could buy, but still felt unseen. The crowd had grown larger now, drawn by the spectacle despite themselves. Richard seemed to feed off their attention, negative or otherwise. His perfectly maintained smile had transformed into something cruel as he prepared to escalate his performance. The guard remained motionless, but those who looked closely might have noticed his knuckles whitening slightly on his ceremonial rifle, the only visible sign of the storm gathering behind his disciplined facade. "You know what your problem is?" Richard's voice had taken on the razor edge he usually reserved for crushing competitors in hostile takeovers. "You think this uniform makes you special. That standing here like some wind-up toy somehow puts you above the rest of us." He moved even closer, his breath fogging the guard's brass buttons. The afternoon sun cast harsh shadows across the courtyard as Richard continued his performance, each word calculated to provoke a response. "I bet underneath all this," he flicked at the guard's scarlet tunic with manicured fingers, "you're just dying to move, to show some sign that you're actually human. Or maybe," his lips curled into a sneer, "they've trained that out of you too." The elderly veterans had drawn closer, their faces set in granite expressions that spoke of battles fought long ago. But Richard's focus had narrowed to the guard before him, his expensive cologne creating a suffocating cloud between them. "Look at him, everyone!" Richard's voice rose theatrically. "The perfect example of wasted potential. While real men are out there building empires, making actual history, you're here," he gestured dismissively, "practicing your statue impression. Tell me, does it hurt, being so utterly insignificant?" The guard's eyes remained fixed forward, but there was something in his bearing now, a subtle tension visible only to those who knew what to look for. The kind of stillness that precedes lightning. His ceremonial rifle, far from being the prop Richard mocked, was held with the precision of someone intimately familiar with its weight and purpose. "You want to know something funny?" Richard circled again, his Italian leather shoes clicking against the stones like ammunition being loaded. "In the time you've been standing here, I've probably made more money than you'll see in a year. That's the difference between us. Yeah. I create value, while you—" He paused for effect. "You create postcards." A young girl in the crowd tugged at her mother's sleeve, asking in a clear voice that carried across the tension, "Mummy, why is that man being so mean?" The question seemed to bounce off Richard like rain off expensive wool, unable to penetrate his armour of entitlement. "Let me teach you something about the real world," he continued, his voice dropping to a mock confidential tone. "All this tradition you're guarding, it's worthless. A relic, like those ancient stones behind you. Impressive to look at, maybe, but ultimately useless in today's world." The sun caught his Patek Philippe watch as he checked it with exaggerated boredom. 20 minutes I've been here, trying to get some sign of life from you. 20 minutes of my very expensive time." His face darkened. "You know what I could do in 20 minutes? Make deals worth more than your entire career. Buy and sell companies that actually matter. But instead—" His expression twisted into something ugly, the carefully maintained facade of sophistication cracking to reveal what lurked beneath. "Instead, I'm standing here being ignored by someone who couldn't afford to clean my shoes. Someone who thinks standing still somehow makes him important." The crowd had grown uncomfortably silent, the only sounds the distant traffic and the rustle of leaves in the afternoon breeze. Even the usual tourist chatter had died away, as if nature itself was holding its breath for what would come next. "You know what?" Richard's voice had taken on a dangerous edge, the kind that usually preceded career-ending decisions in boardrooms. "I think it's time we found out just how dedicated you are to this little act. How much of this," he gestured at the guard's immaculate uniform, "is real, and how much is just cheap theatre?" His hand moved to his mouth, fingers curling against his lips in a gesture that made several onlookers step back instinctively. The elderly veterans exchanged knowing glances, recognizing the signs of imminent escalation. But Richard was past caring about his audience now, consumed by a need to break the dignity that stood before him, mocking his wealth with its quiet strength. "Let's test your famous discipline, shall we?" Richard's voice carried a dangerous edge as he deliberately pressed his fingers deeper into his mouth. The crude gesture drew gasps from the crowd, understanding dawning on their faces as his intentions became clear. The guard remained motionless, but there was a new tension in his frame, the coiled readiness of a soldier preparing for incoming fire. The elderly veterans had started moving forward, but they were too far to prevent what happened next. With a theatrical flourish, Richard triggered his gag reflex. The sound he made was deliberately exaggerated, playing to his unwilling audience. Then, with calculated malice, he directed the stream of vomit directly at the guard's uniform. The acidic splash hit the scarlet tunic, speckling the brass buttons and decorations that had been polished to perfection just hours before. The crowd's collective gasp seemed to pull all the oxygen from the courtyard. A child began crying somewhere in the background, quickly hushed by horrified parents. The afternoon sun caught the wet stains on the guard's uniform, making them gleam like fresh wounds against the ceremonial red. "Oops," Richard managed between heaves, his designer smile twisted into something grotesque. "Guess your precious uniform isn't so perfect anymore, is it?" He straightened up, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand, looking entirely too pleased with himself. "Though I have to say, it's an improvement. Adds a bit of real-world character to all this fancy dress nonsense." The guard's transformation happened in an instant. One moment, he was the epitome of ceremonial stillness. The next, his hand shot out with combat-trained precision, catching Richard's expensive silk tie. The movement was fluid, economical, born of years of military discipline, rather than random violence. "Sir?" The guard's voice cut through the stunned silence like a blade, quiet yet carrying unbridled authority. "You seem to have made a serious error in judgment." His grip on the tie tightened fractionally, forcing Richard to stay uncomfortably close to his soiled uniform. The smirk froze on Richard's face, his earlier bravado evaporating as he found himself locked in the grip of someone whose restraint had been a choice, not a weakness. The guard's eyes, now fixed directly on him, carried the weight of real combat experience, a far cry from the ceremonial statue Richard had mocked. "I've served 3 tours in active combat zones," the guard continued, his voice carrying the steel of actual authority rather than Richard's purchased power. "I've faced enemy fire, lost brothers in arms, and earned every button on this uniform you just desecrated. Would you like to guess how I'm going to handle this situation?" Richard's attempt at a dismissive laugh came out as more of a nervous croak. "You can't. You're not allowed to." His manicured hands moved to his tie, trying to loosen the guard's grip, but found it as immovable as the palace walls. "Actually, sir," the guard's voice took on an edge that made several onlookers step back. "In cases of direct assault, we are authorized to take appropriate action, and you've just assaulted a member of Her Majesty's Guard." His free hand moved to the vomit-stained buttons of his uniform. "Now, I believe you're going to learn a valuable lesson about respect." The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the courtyard as the guard maintained his grip on Richard's tie, the moment suspended between ceremony and retribution. "That blazer," the guard said, nodding at Richard's bespoke Savile Row jacket, "appears to be Tom Ford, custom tailored if I'm not mistaken." His grip on the tie remained steady as Richard's face cycled through shades of red. "Remove it!" "Are you insane?" Richard spluttered, his usual commanding tone reduced to a squeak. "This costs more than you make in—" The guard's grip tightened imperceptibly on the tie. "That wasn't a request, sir. Your jacket, now." With trembling fingers, Richard shrugged out of his blazer, the expensive fabric catching the afternoon light. The guard took it with his free hand, examining the garment with exaggerated care. "Excellent quality," he noted, his voice carrying the same detached professionalism he'd maintained during hours of ceremonial duty. "Perfect for cleaning up your mess." With deliberate movements, he began using the blazer to wipe the vomit from his uniform, the costly fabric absorbing the stains Richard had so eagerly created. "You can't." Richard's protest died in his throat as the guard's eyes met his. In those eyes, he saw something his money couldn't intimidate: the cold certainty of someone who had faced real threats and found this one wanting. "Oh, but I can," the guard replied, methodically cleaning his buttons with what had been a £3,000 jacket. "And I'm not finished." He nodded toward his boots, where some of the vomit had splashed. "Those need attention too." Richard's face drained of colour as understanding dawned. "You don't mean—" "On your knees, sir." The guard's voice was quiet, but carried the unmistakable command of battlefield authority. "Unless you'd prefer I summon the police? Assault on a royal guard carries quite a severe penalty." The crowd watched in stunned silence as Richard Blackwood, who had stormed onto the palace grounds with such arrogance, slowly sank to his knees. His Italian leather shoes scraped against the pavement as he knelt before the guard, his own ruined blazer thrust back into his hands. "Thorough now," the guard instructed, watching as Richard began wiping the boots with shaking hands. "We maintain exceptional standards here, standards you seemed so eager to mock earlier." One of the elderly veterans let out a grunt of approval, his weathered face showing grim satisfaction. Tourists who had been filming quickly lowered their phones, sensing this was a moment of humiliation best left undocumented. "You know," the guard continued conversationally as Richard worked, "these boots have walked through Afghan dust, Iraqi sand, and grounds far less pleasant than this courtyard. But somehow, sir, you've managed to be the most distasteful thing they've encountered." Richard's hands trembled as he worked, his perfectly manicured nails now dirty with his own sick. Each swipe of the ruined blazer seemed to strip away layers of his carefully constructed superiority. "The shine on these boots," the guard added, "represents more than just ceremony. Each morning we spend hours preparing our uniforms, not for tourists' photos or your entertainment, but because it represents a commitment to something greater than ourselves. Something you clearly struggle to comprehend." Finally, after what seemed like an eternity to Richard but was probably only minutes, the guard stepped back to inspect his work. "Adequate," he pronounced, though his tone suggested barely so. "You may rise." Richard stumbled to his feet, his knees damp from the pavement, clutching his ruined blazer like a shield. The crowd had begun to whisper, and he could feel their eyes on him, not with the fear or respect he was accustomed to, but with something far worse, pity mixed with disgust. "I'll have you reported for this," he managed, trying to summon his boardroom authority, but achieving only a petulant whine. "Do you know who I am?" "Oh, I know exactly who you are," the guard replied, resuming his ceremonial stance with fluid precision. "You're someone who just learned that respect isn't purchased, it's earned. And you, sir, have earned exactly what you received." Richard stood there, swaying slightly, his entire carefully constructed world tipped off its axis. His handmade shirt was wrinkled, his perfectly styled hair dishevelled, and his blazer, his precious blazer, was now nothing more than an expensive rag. The guard's eyes fixed forward again, his posture returning to ceremonial perfection. But there was something different now, an added weight to his stillness that spoke of power restrained rather than weakness disguised. The same stillness that had so infuriated Richard now seemed to fill the entire courtyard, pushing him toward the edges of a world he could no longer dominate. Richard stumbled backward, his composure as ruined as his blazer. The guard had already resumed his post, somehow looking even more immaculate after the confrontation, as if the incident had only served to highlight the power of his position rather than diminish it. "This isn't over," Richard snarled, but his voice lacked its earlier confidence. "I've got lawyers who'll what exactly?" One of the elderly veterans stepped forward, his military bearings still evident despite his age. "Explain to a judge how you assaulted a member of Her Majesty's Guard. Please do proceed. I'm sure the court would be fascinated by your defence." Richard's jaw worked silently, his usual arsenal of threats suddenly useless. The crowd had begun to disperse, but not before fixing him with looks that no amount of wealth could shield him from. Parents guided their children away, using him as an object lesson in how not to behave. "Disgraceful!" a well-dressed woman muttered as she passed. "Simply disgraceful!" But even in his humiliation, Richard couldn't find the wisdom to retreat gracefully. His ego, bruised but not broken, demanded some form of retaliation. "You all think this means something?" he spat, gesturing at the guard with his ruined blazer. This whole circus, it's still just a show, a pathetic display of outdated pomp that you just knelt before, the second veteran interrupted quietly. Remember that, young man? When all your money and arrogance were stripped away, you knelt on these stones and cleaned a soldier's boots. Richard's face contorted with rage, but there was something else there now, a flicker of fear. Not of physical reprisal, but of something his wealth had always protected him from, genuine consequence. My father's on the board of, he began, falling back on familiar ground. Your father, the guard's voice cut through the air without him breaking position, would be ashamed, as would anyone who values honour over spectacle. The words seemed to hit Richard like physical blows, but instead of prompting reflection, they only fueled his entitled rage. Honour? He sneered, retreating toward the gates. Honour doesn't buy power. Honour doesn't build empires. You'll still be standing here playing dress-up, While you what? The first veteran asked. Run back to your artificial world where money buys respect? Look around you, son. All your wealth couldn't prevent you from kneeling in your own sick. Richard's driver had appeared, summoned by the commotion. The Bentley's engine purred at the curb, offering escape from this world where his money had failed him. But even as he fled toward it, he couldn't resist one final attempt at salvaging his pride. This entire country's a museum piece, he called back, his voice cracking, and you're all just exhibits, too blind to see it. The guard remained motionless, his silence more powerful than any retort. The sun had begun its descent, casting long shadows across the palace grounds, but his posture remained perfect, a living testament to the values Richard had tried and failed to defile. As the Bentley pulled away, tyres crunching on gravel, the elderly veterans exchanged knowing looks. They'd seen his type before. Men who mistook wealth for worth, who thought power could be purchased rather than earned. You know, the first veteran mused, watching the car disappear, in my day, he wouldn't have left standing. His companion nodded gravely. Different times, though I'd say the lesson delivered was rather more effective. Money can't wash away that kind of shame. The guard maintained his watch as normality slowly returned to the palace grounds. Tourists resumed their photos. Children waved from behind parents' legs, and the afternoon continued its stately progression. In the end, it wasn't about the vomit staining those pristine stones, or even the ruined blazer that cost more than most people's monthly salary. It was about something far more fundamental. The clash between purchased power and earned respect, between shallow authority and deep-rooted dignity. Some might question why a royal guard would break his stance, risk his position, to teach a lesson to someone like Richard Blackwood. But perhaps the better question is, how could he not? The uniform he wears, the position he holds, the tradition he upholds, all of these exist precisely to protect something more valuable than wealth could ever buy. In a world where money often speaks louder than merit, where influence is confused with importance, this incident serves as a powerful reminder. True authority doesn't come from bank accounts or business empires. It comes from standing firm in your values, even when faced with those who mistake their gold cards for character. The guard resumed his watch that day, returning to his ceremonial duty with the same precision and discipline he'd always shown. But everyone who witnessed those events left with a deeper understanding of what that ceremonial duty truly represents. It's not just about standing still. It's about standing for something. What would you have done in that guard's position? More importantly, when faced with people who try to buy respect rather than earn it, how do you respond? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever encountered someone who thought their wealth put them above common decency? How did you handle it? Let us know in the comments section. And if this story reminded you of the importance of respect and dignity, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and join our community where we share powerful reminders of what true service and honor really mean. Click the bell icon to stay notified of our latest uploads. Remember, sometimes the most expensive lesson is the one that teaches you money can't buy respect. Until next time, stay respectful, stay dignified, and never forget, true worth isn't measured in dollars, but in deeds.